Well, howdy, folks, and welcome once again to the American Rancher Podcast. I'm your host, Austin Halverson, and this is the 10th episode of this podcast, which might sound a little different to some of you guys who've been listening because I did just move over to a brand new microphone, and so I'm recording off of that instead of my AirPods for the first time since the podcast began. Today's episode is really special because, like I said, it's the 10th ever episode. They say most podcasts never make it to 10 episodes. In fact, I think about 50% of them stop after 3. So it's a big milestone for me because it proves that this is a podcast that I can continue to work on and it's growing. And rest assured, I have plenty of topics that I still intend to cover. So there's plenty of episodes to come in the near future. But this is also a special podcast for me because this is actually a topic that was the first ever topic that I did research on and wanted to do a podcast on. So you could say that this is the podcast that started, or this is the topic that started this podcast. Whenever I read about Charles Goodnight, I really had this thought that more people need to know about him and wanted to bring to light the interesting story that is his life. So he holds many nicknames and claims to fame, from father of the Texas Panhandle to the man who saved the buffalo, and his life has served as inspiration for some of our favorite works of fiction. But above all else, Charles Goodnight very well may be the most famous rancher of the 19th century. I think we can all agree that that is no easy task when you think of the many, many men who made a mark on our United States history when it came to ranching. So, right after a quick word from our sponsors, we'll get into Mr. Goodnight's story. This is actually going to be a little bit longer podcast than usual because, like I said, it was the first one I ever did, and I was really excited to just really tell the whole story about Charles Goodnight. So I came up with a lot of information and really looking forward to providing that to you, but we'll get into that right after this message from our sponsor. I'm proud to have Elite Ranch Consulting as one of the first sponsors of the Rancher Podcast. Elite Ranch Consulting is your one-stop shop for protecting your real estate investment. Whether you inherited a piece of land, bought a ranch as your vacation home, or are simply looking to maximize the land you already own, Elite Ranch Consulting's team of experts can help you make the right decisions to make your land profitable. Visit EliteRanchConsulting.com today to learn more about how they can help you protect your American dream. Born in March 1836, you could almost say it was fate that Goodnight became associated with Texas, which had claimed its independence and thus had been born that very same month. He spent his first 5 years of life in Macoupin County, Illinois, which is about halfway between Springfield and St. Louis in the southwestern part of the state. But his father died when he was 5 of pneumonia, and his mother proceeded to marry one of the neighboring farmers, Hiram Doherty. When Charles was 9, Texas joined the Union, and the family moved to Milam County in the central part of the newborn state to farm the Brazos Bottom. Milam County is in the center of the triangle created when you run lines from the three cities of College Station, Austin, and Waco. The county's eastern boundary is formed by the Brazos River, and the land around that river continues to be one of the major farming locations in the state of Texas. So there is no doubt that the allure of fertile land and one of the youngest parts of the country was an extremely attractive pursuit for a farmer in southern Illinois. Charles had a childhood that would seem very familiar to most of his frontier contemporaries. He had little to no formal schooling, and at the age of 14 began working on farms in the area to make some money. He also took up jockeying at the nearby Port Sullivan on the Brazos to make money, but he didn't stay at it very long. He was a real rancher at heart. Many of the influences and opportunities from Goodnight's early life were the result of his mother's misfortune in marriages. Charlotte Collier Goodnight had 5 children, and by 1853 was on her third husband, this one the Reverend Adam Sheik. Reverend Sheik was a widower himself, and his son John Wesley Sheik was one of Goodnight's first business partners. The two stepbrothers planned actually to move out to California and start up a farm and ranching operation. Prospectors at the time had struck gold just a couple years earlier, and folks were flocking to California by the mid 1850s. And the combination of thousands of mouths to feed, along with the new wealth of that population, and the discovery of the vast fertile valleys in California, must have been just as alluring to Goodnight as the Brazos Bottom had been to his stepfather 10 years earlier. However, in the end, his family ties kept him in Texas. John Wesley Sheik's brother-in-law placed him and Goodnight in charge of running about 400 head of cattle along the Brazos. Goodnight and Sheik decided to take up the cattle to Palo Pinto County, which is just west of Fort Worth, on the other side of Weatherford. The county was established in 1856, just a year before Goodnight and Sheik arrived. And if you haven't noticed the pattern by now, it seems like Goodnight was always right on the cutting edge of what was only a 70-year-old country at the time. He spent the next few years moving up and down the Brazos with the cattle and other commodities from one farming town and ranching community to another down to the Houston ship channel on the coast. But in the early 1860s, Goodnight proved to be just as tumultuous as they were for the country as whole. Distracted by conflict, there was not much ranching going on in the early 1860s because you can guess the Civil War was breaking out. But it was the latter half of the decade that actually helped him seal his place in history. Like most men of his day on the frontier, Goodnight found himself at odds with the Native Americans in northern Texas. The same year that he moved cattle up the Palo Pinto, he joined the Texas Rangers to aid in waging war on the Comanches in the area. In 1860, Goodnight again found himself on the precipice of American history when he and the posse he was leading found the most famous kidnapped settler in history, which is Cynthia Ann Parker. If you don't know much about Cynthia Ann Parker, you can actually read her story and the story of her son, the famous Quanah Parker, in S.C. Gwynn's book, Empire of the Summer Moon, which is all about the Comanches in Texas. And I know that Joe Rogan made the book famous by talking about it on his podcast, but it talks briefly about the Goodnight episode. But it was pretty interesting to think that this man who became so famous had crossed paths with Parker, but there really weren't that many people in Texas at the time. So Goodnight had actually joined up with the famous ranger and eventual president of Texas A&M, Lawrence Sullivan Ross, or Sully as us Aggies are prone to calling him, to push back a band of Comanches when Goodnight found Parker. She had been missing for almost 30 years when they found her. The story is, again, like I said, provided in Empire of the Summer Moon, but essentially her family, the Parkers, had a settlement over east of the Dallas area, kind of near Waco, a little southeast of Dallas, where they had a fort and they were attacked by Comanches, and she was kidnapped at a fairly young age. So Cynthia Parker's story was actually a fairly tragic one, and like I said, I hope you guys will take time to read about it more. But interestingly enough, his encounter with Cynthia was not the last time he would cross paths with any Parkers and make history. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Goodnight's Ranger Company joined the Confederate Army, but their duties remained the same, and that was protecting the western edge of Texas from the Native Americans. However, the 4 years he spent chasing the Native Americans would prove to not entirely be unproductive for his ranching career. Many folks, left the farm to go fight in the war and really just had to hope that it wasn't burned to the ground by enemy troops, or that their wives and other kinfolk were able to take care of it. But fortunately for Goodnight, his role in the Civil War, like I said, was very similar to what he had been doing for years, which was essentially protecting that western boundary from Indians. So he was able to continue to ranch while carrying out these duties and also actually learn quite a bit about the surrounding land. So his knowledge of the vast plains actually helped him get him a leg up in running cattle. So when you start talking about the cattle drives, it's important to remember that the cattle of 1800s America are pretty different than those produced today. You know, just as I mentioned in the Chisholm Trail episodes, Texas Longhorns, as they were called, looked a bit different than the big-bellied lawn ornaments that we think of today when we see Texas Longhorns. After the Civil War, there were thousands of head of cattle which had been left to their own devices while the men headed east to fight. These cattle were hardy animals, but almost looked scrawny, to be honest. In today's term, think of the steers that are used in the team roping events, but maybe a little bit bigger. The west side of Texas proved to be at the time a ideal habitat for these Texas Longhorns, and Goodnight soon had built himself a sizable herd of more than 10,000 head. However, the beef market was through the floor, so he began to look for another opportunity on the frontier instead of looking towards the east, where there wasn't much of a market. Goodnight met fellow cattleman Oliver Loving after the war, and the two soon struck up a partnership. In fact, in the spring of 1866, just as the war had ended, they set out with around 2,000 cattle to Fort Sumner, New Mexico, in hopes of selling them to feed the soldiers, the settlers, and the Native American prisoners in the region. They set out from Fort Belknap, which is just north of Palo Pinto County and west of present-day Graham, Texas. Fort Belknap at the time was sort of a gateway to the west, especially the southwest, and they at first followed the trail made by the Butterfield Overland Mail, which is a stagecoach that took passengers from the East Coast out to San Francisco. The Butterfield line snaked from Fort Smith in Arkansas southwest through Texas till it headed straight west from El Paso on out to the Pacific coast. And while that existing trail worked for getting Goodnight and Loving through Texas, they split off at the Pecos River and followed it north into New Mexico toward Fort Sumner. When they reached the fort, Goodnight and Loving had 1,600 head remaining from the 2,000 they started with, which, you know, you think about losing 400 head, that's a pretty tough day, but it's not as bad as a lot of other cattle drives have been. So they were actually able to sell half of that at Fort Sumner, and then Loving actually pushed the rest of the cattle up north into Colorado, while Goodnight headed back to Texas with $12,000 of gold in his saddlebag, which is actually, I broke down the numbers, and that is equivalent to almost 840 grand today. Which, you know, is not a bad return, but of course all ranchers could probably guess that this capital went right back into buying more cattle and expanding the operation. This trip was notable for a few reasons. First, of course, it established the Goodnight Loving Trail, which brought much needed meat to the frontier communities and was used for almost 20 years until the railroads finally arrived. However, a more widespread impact came from an innovation that Goodnight made on that trip. With 18 cowpunchers pushing the herd through what was essentially no man's land, Goodnight came up with the idea that would later become known as the chuck wagon. Chuck wagons were full-time cooking operations that could easily provide a nice warm meal for the cowboys at the end of a long day. And we will get into chuck wagons in more detail in future episodes, but it is certainly important to note them in the story of Mr. Goodnight, because he was, in fact, the guy who came up with them. The Goodnight Loving Trail, though, continued to expand over the next few years. In 1867, they moved the northern shot of the trail to the east, making it a little bit more efficient. And by 1868, they were pushing cattle all the way north into Wyoming. By the time they were done, the trail would run from Texas through New Mexico and Colorado to the southern plains of Wyoming. The drives were not without their difficulties, though. Two men and their crews had to contend with scalpers of both varieties. In the northeastern corner of New Mexico, a settler by the name of Dick Wooten took to charging Goodnight a toll per head of cattle for safe passage through the mountains near his place. So yes, even 150 years ago, our forefathers had to contend with toll roads. And honestly, eventually this annoyance led to the innovation that convinced Goodnight to push their trail to the west and avoid Wooten's tolls altogether. However, innovation couldn't save them from the other type of scalpers. Just a year after their first successful drive to Fort Sumner, Goodnight and Loving set off in the spring of 1867 with a new herd to sell. But they were hampered by the rain, and then the Comanches attacked and scattered their cattle. Now, Loving agreed to ride ahead to inform their buyers that their stock was going to be delayed due to these things. However, just south of Roswell, New Mexico, Loving and Bill Wilson were ambushed by Comanches. They survived the bout, but by the time they reached Fort Sumner, which was another 130 miles north, Loving's wounds were so gangrenous and his refusal to amputate his limb proved fatal. Loving was actually buried there in Fort Sumner, but when Goodnight finished the drive up to Colorado, he came back and exhumed the remains of Loving's body to take it back to Texas. Now, some of you might find that story familiar, and for good reason. Larry McMurtry's classic Western novel, Lonesome Dove, was inspired by this final trek back to Texas for Loving's burial. Even after Loving's death, Goodnight continued to split the profits with Loving's family, and it was the visits with his family there in Weatherford, Texas, that led Goodnight to find his wife, Molly. They were longtime sweethearts, but they finally married in 1870. 2 years before that, in 1868, Loving had actually begun to build a ranch in the southwestern Colorado city of Pueblo. He moved Molly up there in 1870 after they got married, and they became really involved in the burgeoning community in this fast-growing western frontier town. You see, Pueblo was incorporated in 1870, and its position at the intersection of the Arkansas River and Fountain Creek, plus its access to the resources needed to make steel, made it an economic powerhouse in the region at the time. The city was known for its steel production for more than a century, and in fact, the current city of Pueblo is made up of a few smaller cities from back then, one of which was named Bessemer, in honor of the man who in 1855 developed the Bessemer process to create steel faster and cheaper than ever before. So these factors actually made it a pretty great town for Goodnight to set up shop and continue to push west. This stint in Colorado also gave us a good look into Goodnight's views on capital. While in Pueblo, he invested his money into the community and not into things for himself. He actually started the Stock Growers Bank to loan money to other cattlemen and bought land and buildings for various projects, including orchards, farms, and even was a co-owner of the local opera. Although the investments may be the wrong word for these things, the nature of continual losses on these purchases and loans made it seem to many much more like charity. And he designed the bank loans to be paid back on the cattleman's convenience instead of a typical monthly payment or interest. And he sold the properties he owned to people he thought would make something of them at the same prices he had bought them instead of selling them for a profit. It's really interesting to think about Goodnight and this part in his life. And we actually get some more insight into why he probably spent his money this way, because he's quoted as saying that his philosophy on money had been cemented by one of his first cattle drives, when he found himself returning home with the saddlebags full of gold. And I'm sure that what he was talking about was that earlier trip that I mentioned, where he had $12,000 in gold. But he still could not buy himself the water that he so desperately desired in the middle of that desert. This philosophy may seem at odds, with the Dave Ramseys of the world, but to some people, there are things that are simply more valuable than a large sum of money in your bank account. Some say you have to spend money to make money, which is true, but Goodnight's investments didn't necessarily fit that mold either. To me, honestly, it looks a lot more like unabashed philanthropy. Actually, I heard a story that the orchards that he had there in outside of Pueblo, he would allow anyone to come and just pick as much fruit as they wanted. So, again, he seemed to be a very generous man who wasn't really that interested in necessarily making a profit, but was more interested in building a community and providing beef to the world. And I think we probably need more people like that in the world that are industrious and they provide jobs and are innovators, but also know that money's not the only thing and that they need to continue to put it back into the community in ways that everyone can enjoy. So I think that's pretty cool of him. But unfortunately for Goodnight, that spending strategy kind of caught up with him and made him extremely vulnerable financially. So in 1873, the world was facing one of the largest economic depressions it had ever seen, which was known as the Panic of 1873, but was also known as the Long Depression. There were a number of contributing factors that led to this being one of the worst worldwide and one of the first worldwide economic recessions. In the United States, the panic can actually be attributed to the major investments in railroads that did not really guarantee returns to investors anytime soon. So you saw a lot of people who, post-Civil War, knew that there was going to be a lot of more infrastructure investing, and they tried to get into it, but a lot of railroad bonds were very, very long-term, and there was no guarantee that you would see a profit for a very long time. So this led to the panic selling of the bonds on railroads and other infrastructure at that time. On top of that, actually, the U.S. changed from the gold and silver standard to solely the gold standard. And this was a critical blow to the silver mining in the West that led to the widespread economic depression in the region. So Goodnight actually sold many of his assets in Pueblo at rock-bottom prices just to be able to cover the taxes and interest from the small fiefdom that he had built there. If he would have been able to hold on a bit longer, he might have been able to benefit from the prosperity the steel industry was about to bring to that region. This actually wouldn't be the last time that an investment turned sour on Goodnight. Nonetheless, though, Goodnight was not going to let this ruin his cattleman dreams. In 1875, he borrowed $30,000 at an 18% interest rate against all of his remaining assets in Pueblo and headed for the Texas Panhandle with almost 2,000 head of cattle. Knowing he still didn't have the means necessary to build a ranch of his dreams, Goodnight requested another loan from John G. Adair. Adair, who was an eccentric Scots-Irish aristocrat who had fallen in love with the American West and wanted a stake in the cattle business, took a keen interest in Goodnight's ambitions and became partners with him in 1877. The contract gave Adair 2/3 stake in the business and profits, but he also loaned Goodnight the third for his stake at 10% interest rate and paid him a salary of $2,500 a year. This proved both Adair's faith in Goodnight's abilities and also his pure eagerness to get into the cattle operation up and running. The only person that I can think of who rushed into the cattle business faster than that was Teddy Roosevelt. But that's a story for another podcast. The J.A. Ranch was established in southwestern Armstrong County near the Palo Duro Canyon and would quickly grow to almost 93,000 acres in the canyon and those surrounding it. In 1879, Goodnight began building the ranch headquarters about halfway between the Palo Duro Canyon and modern-day Clarendon, Texas. This new operations base would essentially become its own little town. There were houses, a bunkhouse, blacksmithing barn, storage for barns, and even cold storage for beef and dairy. So Goodnight actually continued to innovate throughout the 1880s, and he brought in new breeds of cattle to enhance the beef production, and even experimented with crossbreeding cattle with buffalo. Today, many of you might have heard the term beefalo, but Goodnight actually preferred to call his hybrid the catalo, which we'll get back to the buffalo in a minute. In 1880, he also founded the Panhandle Stockmen's Association and was named its first president. The association helped to deter thieves and rustlers, along with laying ground rules for grazing in the area by forming some sort of posse. The associations notably lent aid to Pat Garrett's pursuit and the ultimate killing of the outlaw Billy the Kid in 1881, which is pretty interesting to think that a Stockmen's Association was part of one of these high-level, high-drama outlaw killings. On top of that, Adair was incredibly happy with the more than $500,000 profit that he made through the life of the 5-year contract, And in 1883, he signed on for another 5 years. During that time, the ranch expanded to include 1.3 million acres across multiple counties with more than 100,000 head of cattle. But, unfortunately, Adair would not see the fruition of all this as he died in the spring of 1885, and favor was beginning to turn against the major cattle operations in the West. The wide open prairie was being constantly split and divided by rail lines, settlements, and the state governments. And in 1883, Goodnight engaged in political and legal battles in Austin over the land use. The state had actually started laying claim to lands throughout its boundaries and wanted to charge ranchers to graze their cattle on this land. So the ranchers had been fencing off millions of acres that were actually state-owned land for their own personal use, and they refused to pay a dime to them. Furthermore, the United States at the time was beginning to learn the benefits of conservation and public lands in the 1880s. Men like George Bird Grinnell had become passionate advocates for the founding of national parks and liked to remind people that when these lands were being deforested, grazed on, or poached, that the perpetrators were stealing from them directly as owners of the land. And that really hit a chord with the average person who, might be living in a tenement in New York City or a small house somewhere else that didn't have much land. The fact that there were these men out there with thousands and thousands of acres. So it really did hit a nerve. So the papers at the time actually started calling the West Texas ranchers leeches who were stealing from the state. And more specifically in Texas, they said that they were stealing from the school children of Texas because much of the taxes that Texas was going to capture from these payments from the ranchers was actually going to go towards the education department, which is actually something that here in Texas we still see today as a practice. So that was pretty interesting that they would say that they're stealing from the school children. And the ensuing court battles would make for some wonderful scenes in Texas history. The musical Texas, which is one that plays all summer long in the Palo Duro Canyon, it's a live outdoor musical, is actually set around this era in the Panhandle's history. That show is a really cool one. If you're ever out in the Panhandle near Canyon and Amarillo, Texas, I would really encourage you to go see it because, there's something about seeing a giant musical outside, especially one that's set in a canyon, that's really pretty interesting to watch. But nonetheless, the ranchers were at first pretty successful in getting acquitted on any charges brought related to their illegal grazing, but the war did not end the policies until around the turn of the century. This is an instance, and it's one of the few, where he actually seemed to be on the wrong side of history. But by the end of Goodnight's second 5-year contract with the now deceased Adair, which ended in 1888, Goodnight was seeing the writing on the wall and decided it was time to settle down on a smaller piece of land. But smallative is a relative term when you think about the fact that he was managing more than 1 million acre property. He was also becoming more sympathetic to the progress of the state than many of his fellow ranchers. He was 52 years old, which was actually about 5 years older than the national life expectancy, and at the time, he was 20 years past that for the average rancher. So he decided to buy the Kittiquay portion of the J.A. Ranch and build up a smaller herd there. The Kittiquay Ranch had been settled in the late 1870s by the brothers Jim and George Baker and was bought up by Adair and Goodnight in 1882. Now, allegedly, that sale was not necessarily amicable, and when I say that, the Baker brothers contended that the sale was made to avoid a potential skirmish over grazing in the area. And, when you consider Goodnight's position as the Stockmen's Association president at that time, you kind of think this is a lot like John Dutton from the hit show Yellowstone, and the fact that there were some property sales that kind of hinged on the intimidation coming from a law enforcement agency. So, I don't know if Taylor Sheridan actually based that off of this Goodnight instance, but, it certainly could have been something that inspired him But it's really an interesting story that these two men just went ahead and sold this land that they didn't want to just because they didn't want to get on Goodnight's bad side. So Goodnight made the 140,000 acres his home with 20,000 head of cattle and began establishing the same type of quote-unquote town that he had at the JA Ranch headquarters. However, this one would actually be bigger. I know I said he was going to downsize, but even though there was less acreage, he actually was going to be building a larger town. By 1890, there was actually a post office, a train depot, the blacksmith, and Goodnight College, which was a co-educational institution to help the children of settlers and ranch workers in the region learn how to read and write, which was something that Goodnight had never done. He was actually illiterate, and he depended on his wife Molly to handle all of his correspondence. But he was really, again, determined to invest in bettering the world around him. And the ranch headquarters eventually did become a bona fide town, which still exists today, and it's called Goodnight, Texas. And it hosts the Goodnight Historical Center in Charles's actual beautiful two-story home that's been restored fairly recently. I haven't actually been able to make it out there yet. I really hope to in the coming months because I would love to tour that beautiful old home. But you can see pretty great pictures of it online, and it's a must stop if you're ever in the West Texas region. Now let's talk about those buffalo. The Goodnight Ranch was a true gem of the American West, and everything from its picturesque views of miles of arid plains and canyons to its very own buffalo herd really helped make that image come to life. Speaking of buffalo, from reading letters and records, it appears that Goodnight had held an affinity for the buffalo for quite a while in the 1890s when he started capturing some of them. Actually, in the 1860s, he had tried to add a few of the head of the buffalo to a herd on one of his drives, but he had been pretty unsuccessful, which is understandable when you think about the fact that they were an undomesticated animal. Then, of course, there was his experiment with the cattle on the JA Ranch, where he had tried to breed or crossbreed the buffalo with the cattle. But it was only natural for him to decide to establish an actual herd of buffalo on his new ranch when he had it all to himself. And you know what? This love ultimately is what helped save the great American buffalo from almost certain extinction. The hunters of the mid-1800s in America had little regard for the ideas of conservation, which would become prominent near the end of the century. And on top of that, the exotic and fearless buffaloes made easy targets for predation. There's honestly a lot of theories about this, but you see, the buffaloes are big animals, and because of that, they really don't fear much. We see videos all the time of people visiting Yellowstone who get a little too close and get tossed 50 feet up in the air by a buffalo, so they're not really scared of anything. There's reports that hunters at the time would actually hide underneath the pelts of wolves and crawl up on buffaloes, because even once buffaloes became more aware of the deadly nature of humans, they still weren't scared of wolves. So they would actually crawl up really close to get better shots of them. But between this hunting predation and also the diseases that domesticated livestock were bringing with them, buffaloes were almost completely wiped out. You say they could either outrun or outmuscle any other predators, but they were not bulletproof. And hunters who prized their tongues and hides for everything from coats and delicacies to timing belts for machines drove the animal to the brink of extinction in less than 50 years. Now, Goodnight's herd became instrumental in rebuilding the population of these buffalo across the nation. He donated several head to all kinds of ventures and preserves, including the Bronx Zoo, Yellowstone National Park, and even Buffalo Bill Cody's traveling Western show. Part of the success in preserving the bison also came from Goodnight's diplomatic capabilities. You see, back in 1878, Goodnight had made a treaty with the legendary Comanche chief Quanah Parker, which, as I mentioned earlier, was the son of Cynthia Parker, who Charles Goodnight had saved all those years earlier from the Comanches. And that treaty entailed that the J.A. Ranch would provide free cattle to Parker's tribe in exchange for a promise of no raids. And without this treaty, which provided meat to the Comanches might have actually unintentionally contributed to the demise of the buffalo. So when you think about buffalo today, they probably wouldn't be there without Charles Goodnight. But unfortunately for Goodnight, his misfortune in mining had followed him from Pueblo down to Texas. You see, near the end of his life, like many ranchers, he knew that he couldn't use his own two hands to do much work anymore and probably needed a safer investment to retire on. So he decided to invest most of the money that he had near the turn of the century in a Mexican silver mine in hope of being able to provide for himself once he was too old. However, in a scene that seems to be straight out of Atlas Shrugged, the mine was nationalized by the Mexican government, and Goodnight was left virtually penniless as none of his investment was returned to him. He had to sell his ranch to his friend and oilman, W.J. McAllister, in 1919, and McAllister agreed to allow Goodnight to live on the property until his death. In 1926, his wife died, and Goodnight was 90 years old and not in good health. So, a distant relative named Corinne Goodnight, who was 26, traveled down from Montana to take care of Goodnight, but she actually ended up marrying him, which, all things considered, the fact that she was a relative and the fact that he was 90 years old makes it pretty interesting, but perhaps at that time that was a smart financial decision for both of them, because he wouldn't have to pay her, and of course she would inherit whatever he left whenever he passed away. But surprisingly, the nonagenarian was actually able to get Corinne pregnant, but that pregnancy actually ended in a miscarriage. But I mean, that's absolutely incredible that in your 90s you would be able to father a child. So in December of 1929, at his winter home in Arizona, the American giant Charles Goodnight passed away. Well, he had lived to see the greatest period of Western expansion in the United States, and he had fought in the most important war in our nation's history, and brought groundbreaking innovation to one of the great American industries. He had saved the buffalo and provided an education to children who at the time could have never dreamed of it, and he impacted the lives of so many frontiersmen and women. Goodnight's impact can still be seen today. For one, we still have the buffalo. Then, of course, there's the chuck wagon cooking tradition, which I hope to cover in a future episode. And there's the Lonesome Dove story, and the West Texas towns that he helped thrive. Goodnight was adored by many for his philanthropic spirit and his moral convictions, which is likely why we actually know so much about him. And I think we all know a man or two like Goodnight, because there are some men like that are still around today. It might be your father, your grandfather, a teacher, or someone else in your community, but they are the type of men who get things done, and they have made the American West such a great place to call home. So I hope you enjoyed learning about this American legend, and hope you will continue to join me for more stories and blessings. I really am glad that you guys were able to listen to this episode. Like I said, this was the first one that I ever drafted, and so it might be a little bit different style than some of the other episodes. But I do want to continue to do more long-form podcasts about famous ranchers like this, and really look forward to diving into more topics. So I appreciate you joining me today on the Rancher Podcast, and look forward to future episodes. But until then, Godspeed and God bless.